Royal Guard confirms the tragic news after Princess Charlotte's condition worsens. Princess Charlotte had always been the picture of grace, beauty, and health. As the young daughter of the royal couple, her presence brought warmth and joy to every room she entered. With her soft brown eyes and golden curls, she was a living symbol of the monarchy's future. Beloved by the people, cherished by her family, and admired for her cheerful personality. For many, her smile was a beacon of hope, a reminder that the royal family, despite the pressures and duties of their position, was still human and capable of love. But, as with all stories, life can change in the blink of an eye. The first sign that something was amiss came quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was little more than a slight tiredness, a fatigue that no one paid much attention to. After all, as the daughter of a royal family, Princess Charlotte's life was filled with public engagements, social gatherings, and endless responsibilities. It was only natural to feel exhausted at times, especially when balancing the weight of tradition and expectations. However, over time, those small signs began to grow harder to ignore. She had always been active, playing with her siblings, attending royal events, and taking part in the activities that made her so well loved by the public. But now she was more often seen resting, her energy fading as the days passed. Her parents, the king and queen, tried to ease her burden, but even their love and care couldn't keep the creeping worry at bay. It began with subtle changes. Charlotte would sometimes stumble, her movements slower than before, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on her tiny shoulders. Her once energetic voice now sounded faint, like a melody losing its vibrancy. The royal family had always been a strong unit, used to enduring hardships in silence, but now they found themselves grappling with an uncertainty they could not explain. What was happening to their beloved daughter? The royal doctors were called in to examine her. At first, they reassured the family, claiming it was just a passing illness, a temporary discomfort. However, as the days went on, the symptoms didn't fade, they intensified. Charlotte's face, once flushed with life, began to pale, her cheeks losing the healthy color they had once carried. She grew more withdrawn, preferring to stay in her room rather than play with her friends or engage in the lively activities that had once been her joy. The royal guard, ever vigilant and protective, noticed these changes too. They had always been tasked with ensuring the safety and well-being of the royal family, and they took their responsibilities seriously. Yet in their quiet moments of reflection, they too could see that something was wrong. The usual cheerful energy of the royal household seemed to have dimmed. Even the guards, accustomed to standing tall in the face of public scrutiny and danger, now found themselves quietly whispering to one another, exchanging looks of concern as they observed the princess's decline. The atmosphere in the palace had shifted. Where once laughter echoed through the grand halls, now there was a somber silence. Her parents, visibly worried, tried to keep their anxiety hidden, but even the most carefully crafted masks couldn't conceal their growing concern. The king, a man of strong resolve, found himself pacing more often than usual, his brow furrowed in deep thought. His wife, the queen, struggled to maintain her composure as she attended to her daughter's needs, her hands trembling as she brushed Charlotte's hair or held her close during moments of rest. Despite their best efforts to shield her from the weight of their concern, Charlotte knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the way her parents' faces tightened whenever they looked at her, in the hushed voices of the staff who attended her. As much as she longed to tell them she was fine, to reassure them with her bright smile and contagious laugh, she simply couldn't. Her body felt heavy, as though it were betraying her in ways she couldn't understand. The doctors were called back, and this time they brought in specialists from across the country. Experts in every field examined Charlotte, each one trying to pinpoint the cause of her sudden decline. Yet, despite their best efforts, they found no clear answer. Some suggested stress, others believed it could be a seasonal illness. But the truth was, none of their theories seemed to fit. Each new test brought more questions, more uncertainty. As the days turned into weeks, the royal family's fears grew. What had started as a small concern, a slight tiredness, had evolved into something far more serious. The princess's condition was deteriorating, and yet they still didn't know why. The palace that had once been filled with the vibrant sound of royal duties now felt heavy with silence, every corner shadowed by the growing sense of dread. Behind the closed doors of the royal chambers, the queen would hold her daughter close, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The king, usually composed and steady, now found himself searching the faces of his advisors, his hope waning with each passing day. They all clung to the hope that this was a temporary setback, that their daughter would soon return to her playful self. But deep down, they knew that something far more serious was at play. The royal guards, while still fulfilling their duties with unwavering loyalty, couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow for the family they protected. They had seen the princess grow from a small child into a young woman with a bright future ahead of her. They had witnessed her kindness, her joy, and her ability to light up a room. Now, as they stood watch over the palace grounds, they could do little more than offer silent support to a family in turmoil. Each guard knew that their role was to protect, to keep watch over the royal family and ensure their safety. But this time, there was nothing they could do to protect Charlotte from the illness that seemed to be consuming her. The one thing they had always been able to offer, their strength, was now rendered powerless in the face of this unseen enemy. Days blurred into weeks, and the royal family found themselves holding onto each other for strength. The medical team, now desperate to find an answer, could offer no real explanation for Charlotte's decline. Each new treatment brought little relief, and the uncertainty continued to grow. The princess, once full of life and laughter, now appeared fragile and broken. Her family watched helplessly as she drifted further away from the vibrant young woman they had once known. And so, the royal family stood at a crossroads, uncertain of what the future would hold. The once bright promise of Princess Charlotte's life now hung in the balance, as the royal guard, the family, and the public waited in suspense, hoping for a miracle but fearing the worst. The story of this young princess, so full of potential, was now unfolding in a way no one had ever imagined, one filled with heartache, uncertainty, and the terrifying possibility of loss. As the days passed, the royal family's anxiety deepened, and the once joyful atmosphere at the palace began to feel heavier, overshadowed by fear and worry. What had started as a small concern, a slight change in Princess Charlotte's energy, was now a growing source of distress. The young princess, who had always been full of life, began to fade in a way that no one had expected. She, the bright light of the royal family, seemed to be slipping away from them, and the worry was becoming unbearable. Her parents, king and queen, had always been pillars of strength. They had faced public scrutiny, international diplomacy, and all the pressures of royal life with grace and composure. But this was different. This was their child, their beloved daughter. They had never imagined they would face a situation like this, and every day, the fear of losing her grew stronger. Despite the constant stream of doctors and specialists coming to the palace, no one could offer a clear explanation. The family hoped for good news, prayed for a miracle, but nothing seemed to change. Each visit from a doctor brought a new round of tests, a fresh round of uncertainty, and still no answers. The medical team had already conducted countless examinations, trying to figure out what was causing the princess's health to worsen so quickly, yet no one could come up with a solid diagnosis. Their hearts sank with each passing day, knowing that they were no closer to understanding what was wrong. The queen, ever the caring and devoted mother, tried to keep a brave face for her family. But behind the closed doors of the royal chambers, away from the public eye, the pain was undeniable. The queen held Charlotte close in those quiet moments, running her fingers through her daughter's hair, trying to find comfort in the small things. But Charlotte, once so lively, now barely responded. The princess's beautiful brown eyes seemed distant, unfocused, and her once bright smile had dimmed. Though Charlotte was surrounded by people who loved her, her parents, siblings, staff, and even the royal guards, she seemed to withdraw into herself. The young princess, who had always been a joy to those around her, now lay silent, her energy sapped by something invisible and unknowable. It wasn't just her body that was weakening. Her spirit, too, seemed to be fading. She no longer showed the enthusiasm she once had for the things she loved. Her once bubbly personality had turned inward, and she seemed to lack the will to fight against whatever was draining her. King, who had always been so confident and composed, now found himself standing in the royal study, pacing restlessly as he tried to think of a solution. His strong, steady hands were often clenched into fists as he thought about what could be causing his daughter's condition. How could he protect her from this invisible force? What could he do to help her? Every answer seemed to elude him, and the helplessness that settled in his chest was overwhelming. No matter how much he tried to reassure the family and the public that everything would be all right, the truth was, he didn't know. He was just as lost as the rest of them. The royal guard, too, began to feel the weight of the situation. They had always been there to protect the royal family, guarding the palace and ensuring their safety. But now, it felt as though they were standing by helplessly, unable to offer anything but support in a time when real answers were needed. The guards had seen the princess grow from a joyful child into a young woman, and now they stood at attention, each of them feeling the pain of watching someone they had sworn to protect slowly fade away. Their duty had always been to guard against external threats, but now they were witnessing a more personal battle, a fight within the walls of the palace. As the royal family tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, the guards watched closely. They could see the worry in the king and queen's eyes, the way their faces were growing wearier with each passing day. It was clear that no one in the palace could escape the weight of the situation. The quiet worry of the royal family, the sorrow in their hearts, was palpable. Charlotte's siblings, too, were affected by her declining health. They had grown up alongside her, sharing in the joys and sorrows of life in the royal family. Seeing their sister in this condition left them shaken, unsure of how to comfort her or what to do. There were no answers, and no amount of royal protocol could change the reality of what was happening. The king and queen tried to shield their other children from the worst of it, but they too sensed the tension in the air. The palace, once a place of laughter and joy, now felt like a quiet prison of worry. As the days turned into weeks, Princess Charlotte's condition continued to worsen. The medical team suggested different courses of action, trying one treatment after another, but nothing seemed to have a lasting effect. Charlotte grew weaker, and her family's hope seemed to fade along with her health. The doctors were no longer certain of what to do. They had exhausted every option they knew, and still, there was no answer. The lack of a diagnosis only deepened the sense of helplessness that filled the royal palace. It was as if the very people who were meant to save her were now as lost as her family. In the public eye, the royal family tried to maintain a facade of strength. The king and queen attended royal events, showing no outward sign of their personal struggle. But those closest to them, like the royal staff and guards, could see that the situation was far from normal. The royal couple could no longer hide their pain. Their daughter's suffering was too evident, and every time they put on a brave face in front of the cameras, their hearts ached even more. But behind closed doors, the royal family was unraveling. The queen's gentle hands trembled as she tried to care for Charlotte, her heart breaking as she saw the life drain from her child's body. Every morning brought a sense of dread, knowing that their worst fear might become a reality. Would their precious Charlotte survive this? Or would they lose her, as so many had feared in their most silent moments of worry? The royal family was stuck in a state of limbo. They had no answers, only questions. They had no control, only helplessness. In the meantime, the guards continued to fulfill their duties, standing watch over the palace, each day weighed down by the knowledge that their beloved princess was in trouble. They, too, could only wait and hope, uncertain of what the future would bring. And all the while, the world continued around them. The sun rose and set, life moved on, but inside the palace walls, time seemed to stop. Each day stretched on longer than the last, and no one knew when or if the nightmare would end. The silence in the royal palace had deepened. What had begun as a quiet concern now felt like an overwhelming presence, hanging in the air, impossible to escape. The once bright and bustling halls were now filled with a heavy stillness, where each passing moment felt like an eternity. Princess Charlotte, the beloved daughter of the royal family, had slowly become a shadow of the vibrant young woman she once was. Her smile, which used to light up the room, had disappeared, replaced by a quiet exhaustion that seemed to drain her strength day by day. It was early in the morning when the dreaded news finally arrived, breaking the fragile calm that had descended over the royal household. The doctors had been running tests for weeks, trying to identify what was causing Princess Charlotte's condition to worsen so quickly. Their visits to the palace had become a regular part of the day, but this time, the royal family could sense something different in the air. The usual polite assurances were absent. This time, there were no comforting words to offer. The king and queen waited anxiously in their private chambers, surrounded by the medical team. The room was filled with an uncomfortable tension, as if everyone knew what was coming but was too afraid to speak it aloud. The queen sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. Her face, once full of grace and composure, now seemed worn and tired, marked by the toll this ordeal had taken on her. The king stood by her side, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, trying to hold on to the last bit of strength he had left. They both knew that this moment, the moment when the truth would be revealed, had arrived. One of the lead doctors, his face grim, approached them. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a sadness that was impossible to hide. He looked directly at the king and queen and took a deep breath before speaking. The words that followed would change everything. "We have the results," the doctor said softly. "I'm afraid the news isn't good. Princess Charlotte's condition has worsened significantly, and we believe it is beyond our ability to help her." For a moment, the words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The king and queen remained still, their faces drained of color, as though the very breath had been knocked out of them. They had known this day might come, but hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud, was more than either of them could bear. The queen's eyes filled with tears, though she fought to keep them from falling. Her hand reached out for the king, and for the first time in many days, he allowed himself to hold her hand in return. They were both utterly helpless, unable to find the words to console each other. They had always been a united front, the face of strength for their family and their people. But now, in this moment of crushing sorrow, they were reduced to two parents, lost in the anguish of watching their child suffer. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, offering no real comfort, but merely confirming what everyone had feared. They explained that Princess Charlotte's illness, whatever it was, had spread through her body more aggressively than they had anticipated. They had tried every treatment they knew, but nothing seemed to work. The princess's condition had deteriorated beyond medical understanding, and there was nothing more they could do. The princess, so full of life just a short time ago, was now fighting a battle that no one could win. The king and queen listened, but the words barely registered. It was as though their minds couldn't process what they were hearing. The realization was too great, too painful. The queen felt her knees weaken, and she leaned heavily against her husband, unable to hold herself upright. He, too, felt the weight of the news pressing down on him, his usually strong and composed demeanor slipping away under the crushing sorrow. They were both in a daze, stunned by the reality of what was happening. Outside the room, the royal guards stood watch, their expressions somber as they listened to the soft murmur of voices inside. They had been trained to stand firm in the face of danger, to protect the royal family at all costs. But this was different. There was no enemy to fight, no threat to defend against. The enemy was unseen, and it was inside the very heart of the family they were sworn to protect. They could only wait, standing silently outside the royal chambers, feeling helpless and powerless. The guard who had been with the royal family the longest, a man who had seen the princess grow from a young child into a young woman, found himself overcome with emotion. He had always seen the royal family as symbols of strength, as untouchable figures who could withstand anything. But now, watching the pain in their eyes, he realized that even the strongest families could be broken. Inside the room, the doctors continued to speak, but their voices became distant as the king and queen sat in stunned silence. They could hear the words, but they didn't truly register. The doctors were offering advice, suggesting that they prepare themselves for the worst, that they might not have much time left with their daughter. The king's mind spun, trying to find any shred of hope, any reason to believe that things could improve. But deep down, he knew that this was the reality they had been dreading. The queen, her face pale and drawn, slowly turned to look at the king. She was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" The king didn't have an answer. There were no words that could fix this, no actions that could make it right. He could only hold his wife and silently share in her grief. They were united in their sorrow, but that was small comfort in the face of the pain that threatened to consume them both. As the royal family tried to come to terms with the devastating news, the palace staff began to prepare for what lay ahead. The royal guards, though still standing firm in their duty, felt the shift in the air. The atmosphere had changed. No longer was the palace a place of celebration and joy. Now it was a place of mourning, where every moment felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any time. The princess, once so full of life, lay in her room, barely conscious of the growing chaos around her. Her family, in their grief, could only watch as the final days of her life slowly slipped away. The hope that had once fueled the royal household had dimmed, leaving only the cold weight of reality. The news was confirmed, and there was no going back. The royal family had always been symbols of resilience and strength, but in this moment, they were simply a family, desperate to hold onto their daughter for as long as they could. And as the royal guards continued their silent watch over the palace, they too were faced with the painful reality that some battles couldn't be won, no matter how hard you fought. The palace was no longer a place of joy. Once, the halls had been filled with laughter and light. The grand rooms had echoed with the sound of music, the busy hustle of royal duties, and the quiet whispers of important decisions being made. But now, the walls seemed to close in on themselves, suffocating under the weight of sorrow and dread. The royal family had entered a time of uncertainty, where each new day felt like a gift and a curse at the same time. For every moment they spent with Princess Charlotte, there was the painful reminder that they might not have much longer with her. Princess Charlotte's health continued to worsen. The doctors had done everything they could, but it was clear now that their efforts were no longer enough. The medications, the treatments, the countless hours of care, they had all failed to reverse what was happening to her. The once vibrant and lively young woman had become a fragile shadow of herself. She spent most of her time lying in bed, her energy drained, her face pale and thin. The light in her eyes, which had once sparkled with enthusiasm, was now dim and distant. The doctors who had once been hopeful now spoke in quiet tones, knowing there was nothing more to be done. For her parents, every moment spent with her was both precious and painful. The Queen, in particular, found it difficult to accept. She had been a strong and composed mother, always the one to maintain order in the palace and ensure that her children were well cared for. But this was beyond anything she could control. The Queen spent hours by Charlotte's bedside, holding her hand, brushing her hair, and whispering comforting words, even if Charlotte could no longer respond. She watched her daughter slip further away, helpless in the face of the inevitable. The king, too, was struggling to come to terms with the reality of the situation. A man of great strength and resolve, he had always been the protector of his family. But now, there was nothing he could do to protect Charlotte from this cruel fate. He had fought wars, dealt with crises, and faced countless challenges throughout his reign, but nothing had prepared him for this. The pain of watching his daughter suffer was like nothing he had ever experienced. His heart ached for her and for the Queen, whose face showed the strain of sleepless nights and endless worry. Every day, the family's pain deepened. The royal guards, too, were affected. They had sworn to protect the royal family with their lives, but they now found themselves powerless in the face of a fate that no one could escape. They watched from the sidelines, their hearts heavy with sorrow, as the princess they had known and cared for became weaker with each passing hour. It was a grim reality they couldn't change, and that helplessness left an unspoken sadness hanging in the air. The palace, once a bustling symbol of power and prestige, now felt like a quiet, sorrowful place. The staff moved through the halls in silence, their faces reflecting the sadness that had overtaken the royal family. No one dared speak too loudly, as though doing so might disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the palace. Even the usual sounds of the royal life, the clinking of silverware at meals, the rustle of royal garments, felt muted and distant, as if the very air was holding its breath. And yet, in the midst of all this sadness, there was an undeniable sense of love. Despite the overwhelming grief, there were moments of tenderness, moments where the royal family found comfort in one another. The king would sit beside the Queen in silence, holding her hand as they both watched Charlotte sleep. The Queen would lean her head against her husband's shoulder, finding a small amount of peace in his presence. Their children, though heartbroken, still tried to offer their support, standing by their parents' sides and quietly comforting each other in their own ways. But the true weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. Princess Charlotte's condition continued to deteriorate, and the hope that had once lingered in their hearts was now fading. It was a feeling that the royal family could not escape. Every day, they faced the quiet reality that their time with Charlotte was running out. In these final days, the atmosphere in the palace became more somber. Even the most ceremonial of events, those that would usually require the royal family to appear before the public, were postponed. The king and queen had made it clear that their family's well-being came first, and no amount of public duty could take precedence over the time they needed to spend with Charlotte. The outside world continued, but inside the palace, time seemed to stand still. One afternoon, the royal family gathered in Charlotte's room. She lay in bed, her face pale and tired, her once vibrant eyes barely open. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft murmur of the king and queen speaking to her, their voices filled with love and sadness. The family had learned to treasure these quiet moments, knowing that each one could be their last. The queen gently took Charlotte's hand in hers, brushing the princess's hair away from her face. She spoke softly, her voice breaking as she whispered words of comfort to her daughter. "You've been so brave, my sweet girl. You've made us so proud. Always remember how much we love you." The king stood at the foot of the bed, watching his wife with a look of deep sorrow. His own voice was barely audible as he spoke. "You've always been the light of our lives, Charlotte, and you always will be." For a moment there was silence again. The royal family, surrounded by the stillness of the room, could do nothing but hold onto one another, finding strength in the bond they shared. Despite everything that was happening, despite the crushing weight of their grief, they knew they had each other. Outside the room, the royal guards remained at their posts, standing watch over the palace. Though they were used to being the silent protectors of the royal family, this was different. They had seen their fair share of sadness over the years, but this was a different kind of sorrow, one that cut deep into their hearts. The princess, who had always brought so much light to the palace, was slipping away, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The days seemed to stretch on, each one more difficult than the last. The medical team, though they continued to monitor Charlotte's condition, knew that they could no longer offer hope. They had done everything they could, but it was clear that the end was near. Princess Charlotte's life, once filled with promise, was coming to an end, and the royal family had no choice but to accept the painful truth. As the final days passed, the royal family found themselves embracing each other more tightly, holding on to the love they had for one another. The queen, though devastated by the loss of her daughter, knew that her love for Charlotte would never fade. The king, too, found solace in the love they had shared as a family, knowing that their bond would remain even in the face of loss. Princess Charlotte, though she could no longer speak or move, remained at the center of their world. She was their daughter, their joy, and their love. And in her final moments, she was surrounded by the family who had loved her from the moment she was born, holding her close as they whispered their final goodbyes. The days that followed felt like a blur. Time moved at a pace that seemed to stretch and contract, heavy with sorrow and uncertainty. In the heart of the royal palace, there was an undeniable shift. The once vibrant rooms, filled with laughter and life, now felt empty and cold. The atmosphere was thick with the heavy silence of grief, and every corner of the palace seemed to echo with memories of Princess Charlotte, memories of her smile, her laughter, and the warmth she had brought to everyone she met. The king and queen, though always dignified, were struggling to carry the weight of the loss. The once strong and composed royal couple now moved through the halls like two people trapped in a fog. Their hearts, once filled with hope, were now shattered. The princess they had cherished and loved for so long was gone. Despite the quiet strength they had shown during Charlotte's illness, the pain of losing their daughter was beyond anything they had prepared for. The queen had not left Charlotte's side for days, her eyes swollen from crying, her voice hoarse from whispering words of comfort to the still body of her daughter. The king, who had always been the pillar of the family, now seemed broken, his stoic demeanor slipping away under the weight of the loss. In the royal household, the staff moved quietly, each person mindful of the sorrow that hung in the air. There was no need for words, everyone knew what had happened. Princess Charlotte was gone, and the royal family's world had been torn apart. The royal guards, standing silently at their posts, felt the weight of the loss as well. They had served the royal family with unwavering dedication, always ready to protect and defend, but this was a kind of loss they could not prevent. As the news of Charlotte's death spread through the palace, the guards stood at attention, their faces somber, their hearts heavy with grief. The royal family had always been a symbol of strength and resilience, but now they were just a family mourning the loss of a daughter, a sister, a beloved member of their household. And despite the world watching, they were left to face this heartache in private. But even in the face of such devastation, they understood that the world would need to know. The royal family was not just a private entity. They were figures of public interest, and the world had watched Charlotte grow up. Her loss would be felt by millions, and the announcement of her passing would be a moment that would echo across the globe. It was the royal guard's responsibility to ensure that the announcement was made with the dignity and respect that Charlotte deserved. They had been with the family through every moment, watching over them in times of happiness and sorrow. Now, they would play a quiet but important role in ensuring that the tragic news was shared with the world in the right way. The guard who had been closest to the royal family felt the weight of this responsibility on his shoulders. He had always been the one to stand firm, offering protection and strength, but today he too felt the sting of loss. This wasn't just a job, this was personal. The time had come. The royal family, though heartbroken, knew they had to share the news with their people. The king and queen gathered in their private chambers, their hands clasped tightly together. The queen, though still grieving, found the strength to speak the words that had to be spoken. "It is with the deepest sorrow that we share the loss of our beloved daughter, Princess Charlotte," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "She passed away quietly in her sleep, surrounded by her family. Our hearts are broken, but we are forever grateful for the love and joy she brought into our lives." The king's voice was low and full of grief as he added, "Princess Charlotte was a beacon of light in our family and in the hearts of all those who knew her. We will carry her memory with us always." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. The royal family had lost something irreplaceable, and the loss was felt by everyone who had known Charlotte. The world would mourn her, but no one would feel the loss as deeply as her family did. The royal guards, standing outside the chambers, heard the announcement. Their heads bowed in silent respect for the princess they had sworn to protect. They had been by her side through every moment of her life, and now they would be there for her family, offering their unwavering support in a time of unimaginable sorrow. They knew the world would watch, but they also understood that this was a deeply personal loss, one that would take time to heal if healing was even possible. The news spread quickly, as it always does, and soon the world was mourning the loss of Princess Charlotte. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. From world leaders to ordinary citizens, people expressed their sadness and shared their condolences. Social media was flooded with messages of support for the royal family, each one filled with love and respect for the young princess who had touched so many hearts. Her legacy would live on in the memories of those who had known her, and in the impact she had made during her short life. As the days passed, the royal family remained in seclusion, holding each other close as they navigated the difficult path of grief. The king and queen spent most of their time in private, surrounded by family and close friends, finding what comfort they could in each other's presence. The royal guards continued to stand watch, their solemn duty unchanged, though their hearts too were heavy with sorrow. The funeral was a quiet affair, a private ceremony for close family and friends. It was a time to say goodbye, to honor Charlotte's life, and to celebrate the joy she had brought to so many. The royal family, though devastated, understood that this was not just a goodbye. It was a way to ensure that Charlotte's memory would live on, that her legacy of kindness and warmth would never be forgotten. The ceremony was filled with beautiful tributes, poems, songs, and flowers, each one a reflection of the love and admiration Charlotte had inspired in everyone who had known her. As the royal family began to heal, they knew that life would never be the same without Charlotte. But they also knew that her spirit, her warmth, and her love would remain with them forever. The king and queen had lost their daughter, but they still had each other, and they had the love and support of the world. In time, the pain of the loss would lessen, though it would never disappear. And though Princess Charlotte was no longer with them, her memory would live on, not just in the hearts of her family, but in the hearts of all those who had been touched by her life. The royal guards, standing tall and silent, would continue to serve the family they had sworn to protect. But they, too, would carry the memory of Princess Charlotte with them, a memory of a young woman who had brought light into their lives and whose passing had left a hole in their hearts. The world had lost a princess, but the royal family had lost a daughter, and the pain of that loss would stay with them for the rest of their lives.